Hi, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the Bible in Plain Sight. My name is Carol Evans. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I am so excited to share with you this redeeming story of the book of Ruth. I'm excited, and also I feel like I don't want this to last too long. I want to do the story justice. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. So I'm going to dive right in. When you open the book of Ruth, you find the story of Elimelech and Naomi, and they leave their home in Bethlehem, and they go over to Moab. Moab would have been about 50 miles away. So if they traveled on foot, it would have been about 7 to 10 days on foot. Maybe they had camels or donkeys, and it didn't take them 7 to 10 days, but it took them a couple days to get there. So we don't know how long they were in Moab, but we know that after Elimelech died and Mahlon and Chilion were old enough to get married, they were married for about 10 years before they passed away, leaving their mom a widow in a foreign land. And when you think about being in Moab and Bethlehem were not fun, like sister cities. Moab and Bethlehem, they didn't get along with each other at all. So when Naomi said, girls, I've got to go back home, in Moab, they had no law to take care of their widows. And in Bethlehem, they did. And so she knew she would at least be fed and taken care of. In Moab, she had no financial support there at all. So she leaves, and Orpah at first says, I'll come too. And Ruth says, I'll come too. And she says, no, I can't have any more children. You won't be taken care of. There's literally no hope for you if you come with me. There's nothing for you if you come with me. She is obviously very, very sad and depressed. She's lost her husband. She's lost her 2 boys. She's devastated. And Ruth says, I'll stay. But before we go to probably the most quoted verses in the book of Ruth, I want to paint a picture for you of the difference between Moab and Bethlehem. Because Moab, they had maybe a different dialect, so they would have understood their language, but they would have spoken a little differently. Their religion was different. They had completely different religions. And earlier on in the Old Testament, the Moabites were actually forbidden from going into the temple. If you were from Moab, you were from Lot's son. So Lot's son that he had with his daughter. So those 2 countries did not get along at all. They were enemies for hundreds of thousands of years. So when Ruth says in verse 16 of chapter 1, she says, entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest, I will go, where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. And Lord, do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. So when she's saying all these things, she knows it's going to be hard. She knows. And Naomi says, okay, fine. If you're that stubborn, you can come with me. So they go, and they make the long journey. I don't know if they went by themselves. Probably not. Typically, they would have joined another caravan or party going that direction because it was just so dangerous for 2 women to travel alone like that. So they get to Bethlehem, and Naomi she is devastated still. She is in mourning. She says, change my name. I'm not even who you remember I was. I'm different. I have gone through so much. I'm not even the same person. I've lived in a pagan land. I have no right to the land that I had with my husband. Can you imagine being in a country or going back home to your home country? I can't even imagine pulling back up in my yard and seeing the place where Dave and I raised the boys and saying, I have no right or authority to move back into my home. Even though no one else is living there, I have no right or authority to live in that home. That must have been incredibly difficult. Incredibly difficult. But I want to think about and go to verse 22 of chapter 1. Okay, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. In the beginning of the barley harvest. So when you read down through chapter 2, you see how Naomi is explaining to Ruth how things work in Bethlehem. See, in Bethlehem, for rich farmers, that's what they would do to help take care of their poor, their orphans, and their widows. The rich farmers would leave grain on the outside of their field so that they could glean. That was in essence how they, instead of, food stamps or a food bank or anything like that, that was their government assistance. That was how they took care of their people. So Naomi is telling Ruth, you've got to go gather. And Boaz is related to us, so you've got to go do this. So read chapter 2 to get all the details with that. But Ruth is gleaning in the fields. What's interesting to me is if you look at chapter 2, you have all the details there, how Boaz begins to recognize her and she gleans, and you've got all these stories at the back and forth in her gleaning. But here's what's interesting. In verse 23 of chapter 2, so she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest. Reading this book growing up, I always thought it was a beautiful love story. I never really thought about how long she gleaned. She gleaned from the beginning of the harvest to the end of the harvest. This was not where she put in a couple days of hard work and this beautiful lady from another land wooed Boaz with her accent. That's not how it went. She worked hard labor on her hands and feet in the dirt for the entire barley harvest. That is hard. That is very hard. And I so wonder, I cannot wait to get to heaven and talk to Ruth one day. I so wonder if when she's on her hands and knees in the dirt, if she did not stop and say, God, I left my home. I left my family. I left all the gods that were familiar to me. And I came to serve you with this widow woman who is depressed and angry. And here I am in the dirt. This isn't how I thought they were going to take care of us. But she served the whole barley harvest. So if you look at some different websites and things that talk about the harvest, the barley harvest, a lot of them will say it lasted about 6 months, depending on all the different things that they were gleaning. And depending how many things were planted, she would have been gleaning for about 6 months, depending on the weather and the seasons. But 6 months. When you read that chapter 2, it doesn't read like 6 months. Obviously, it was written after the fact of the whole story, but 6 months she gleaned. 6 months. And then you finally see Naomi realize, hey, there might be something here. And she sends Ruth back into Boaz. They realize that he's the next, not really the next, but he's got to go talk to somebody else. But that's so interesting because if you think about it, there's so many times when we try ourselves to redeem our own story, but we can't redeem our own sin. I couldn't work hard enough to redeem me in a sinful place. There's no good work I can do to redeem myself from being a sinner. And there's nothing Naomi could have done because of the laws at that time. There's nothing she could have done to redeem that land. Absolutely nothing. A woman, she couldn't have even gone to the city gates and talked to the men about it, let alone fight for it. Only God could have redeemed it. And only Boaz, who then had to go to the other next of kinsmen and said, I'll redeem the land. But by redeeming the land, he said, I'll not only redeem the land. To redeem someone's land that wasn't there to claim it meant that you also took his next of kin and you kept on with his line. So that meant that Ruth's children, they would inherit Elimelech's land. That meant that Boaz would share in that. That is incredibly powerful. When you think about God redeeming your story, I don't know how long your barley harvest is, and I'm not going to lie and say that joy comes in the morning. It's probably almost over. Your barley harvest will be over tomorrow. Just stay faithful. I don't know that. Maybe you're in the very beginning of your barley harvest. Maybe it feels like you've been in it year after year after year. But I do know that no matter where you are in your barley harvest and no matter what part of that process you're feeling right now, I know that the same God that redeemed Ruth's story, this woman that looked different, this woman that probably talked different, she had different gods, different idols that she was used to worshiping. She changed everything about her life and did manual labor in a field for 6+ months. She was probably, a lot of scholars say, probably in her early 40s. She wasn't exactly in her prime. She'd already been married for about 10 years. We don't know exactly how old she was, but she had been married. She wasn't a super young flower. And she comes and she serves this God. And God redeems her story. And just like God redeems our life when we become a Christian and God redeems us and we have a new destination in heaven, exactly like that, Boaz did for Ruth and Naomi. So friends, I don't know where you are today in your story. I don't know if you're looking at that God and you're like, how could God redeem this? Because I am a mess. God could never redeem this. He can. He can redeem your story. He can redeem your life. Maybe you're in the middle of a barley harvest and you're thinking back to those first few verses and you're like, I made promises to God because I thought he was going to be faithful. I thought if I made a promise to God that I wouldn't go through a hard time. And maybe it sounded something like, entreat me not to leave you, or to return from following after thee. Whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, my God, your God. Maybe all of those things you said early on in your Christian life. And now it's like, but I'm in the middle of this ridiculously long barley harvest. And what if God didn't hear me? I didn't think I would be really doing all of this in this harvest, in this season. And here you are. And friends, I don't know where you are. I don't know what this barley harvest looks like for you. But I know that God can redeem your story. I know that he has the power and the ability to redeem. In those 6 months, he was working. Boaz was seeing her. There was things that were happening behind the scenes. She just didn't know it. He was going to redeem it. You know what's interesting to me? Is that Boaz's mom was Rahab. Boaz's mom was Rahab. Boaz knew what it was like from the stories of his mother to be a woman in a foreign land, to have no lineage, to have no background to justify where she was. That was Boaz's mom. And I can only imagine him seeing Ruth and thinking, this feels like something my mom told me her life was like. And I wonder if the Lord used his mom to just soften his heart for her, because she was different. She would have looked different. She was out in the field working. He didn't even hear her talk. And he said, who's that? Who's that woman? She's different. It's a small town. Bethlehem is a very small town. And then, isn't it amazing? I don't know why I never realized this. They're in Bethlehem, where 10 or 13 generations later, from their lineage, Jesus would be born in the same town. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? From the same town. You have the son of Rahab the harlot, who married Ruth from Moab. And God redeemed their story. God redeemed Rahab's story. He redeemed Ruth's story. He redeemed Naomi's story, who was bitter and angry. And she said, just, my name is Mara. You know, at the end of the book, no one ever called her Mara anymore. They called her Naomi. They called her Naomi again. So friends, no matter where you are on your barley harvest or where you are in your story of redemption, just know that God has an amazing plan for your life. It won't be perfect because we're still human, but God has an amazing story for your life, and he can and he will redeem your story if we'll allow him to. If we will let go of the reins and let him drive, he will redeem your story. Stay tuned this week. We've got some awesome stories coming up, some personal testimonies that I'm really excited for you to see and for you to share. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you'll join me later this week. Thank you all. Have a good day.